Hello. During this session, we're going to be looking at Job 29, 30, and 31. This is a monologue. It's called a discourse, but it's a monologue. Job is filling us in on information. So let's dig in. Job 29, verses 1 through 6 says, "And Job again took up his discourse and said, Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were all around me, when my steps were washed with butter, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil." Job remembers the good old days. It seems that he thinks God has left him, and he's remembering the days when God was with him, when God was for him. Again, he's still more concerned about the loss of his relationship with God than the loss of his things, although we do hear him mention his children when his children were all around. He paints such a beautiful picture of his former happy life when everything was blessed. In verse 6, when it says, washed with butter and streams of oil, those are pictures of prosperity. This is the equivalent of the idea of the promised land being a land of milk and honey. A rock pouring out streams of oil. Olive trees were usually planted in rocky soil. So when the olive oil came, it was coming out of a tree that was in a rock. Verses 7 through 17. "When I went out to the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew, and the aged rose and stood. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouth. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it approved, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help them. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made him drop his prey from his teeth." So this is a picture of him at the city gates. The city gates was like their court. All the elders sat at the city gates, and they were the community leaders, and they judged cases. And he remembers how he was one of those elders. Even princes and nobles stopped to talk to him. We have no idea what kind of city it was, what city it was. We get a picture of him being honored in his position as a city judge. He says his reputation for wisdom and goodness was well deserved. He was full of good and noble works, especially to the poor and disadvantaged. Up till now, he hasn't really pointed out his good deeds. He's taken his stand on faith alone and not his works. But now he's talking about what he's done. Remember, his friends had given him a list of crimes against the poor. Here, Job counters with a list of how he helped the poor and needy. Verses 18 through 20 says, "Then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply in my days as the sand. My roots spread out to the waters, with the dew all night on my branches. My glory fresh with me, and my bow ever new in my hand." He says he felt like he was going to die in his home at peace and rest, and he was going to have long days, and everything was going to be glorious. Again, he's remembering what his thoughts were at the time. When it says, "I shall multiply my days as the sand," some versions say like a phoenix. Basically, whichever one, it means a long life. Verse 19 is a picture of a healthy tree growing beside a stream, which causes it to flourish no matter the season. Verses 21 through 25 says, Men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After I spoke, they did not speak again, and my word dropped upon them. They waited for me as the rain, and they opened their mouths as for the spring rain. I smiled on them, and when they had no confidence, and the light of my face they did not cast down. I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. He's talking about how he was a respected judge. His word was taken as law. People listened to him. No one criticized him. He lived a wonderful life as a wealthy and powerful man. And it was a life that was giving to others. In Job 30, starting verse 1 through 8, But now they laugh at me, men who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs of my flock. What could I gain from the strength of their hands, men whose vigor is gone? Through want and hard hunger they gnaw the dry ground by night in waste and desolation. They pick saltwort and the leaves of bushes and the roots of the broom tree for their food. They are driven out from human company. They shout after them as after a thief. In the gullies of the torrents they must dwell, in holes of the earth and of the rocks. Among the bushes they bray, under the nettles they huddle together. A senseless and nameless brood, they have been whipped out of the land. Job is tortured by the irony of this all. He is being mocked by the sons of men that he wouldn't have even allowed to care for his flocks, or to care for the dogs that cared for his flocks. These were men that had been expelled from respectable tribes, and they lived by thieving. They are still common east of Jordan in the nomadic regions. So remember, dogs were not pets. They were thought of as filthy, cursed animals. So these are men that he wouldn't even allow care for his filthy, cursed animals. This is a pretty lengthy description of good-for-nothing fathers and their sons. It's a special brand of rhetoric. The modern Western mind prefers understatement. But this is Semitic language, and it is all about overstatement. This style of writing is a mystery to us. In 6 different ways, he highlights debauchery, and it just heightens the pathetic nature of his dishonor. Those who experience rejection are rejecting him when he was so full of honor. Notice there's a theme in here. There's plants. Verse 4 talks about saltwort. Saltwort was a plant that was eaten by the super poor people that had nothing else to eat. A broom shrub is a desert plant, usually used to make charcoal. Those are the 2 plants that are not as familiar to us. Verse 9 through 15 says, And now I have become their song. I am a byword to them. They abhor me. They keep aloof from me. They do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me. Because God has loosed my cord and humbled me. They have cast off restraint in my presence. On my right hand the rabble rise. They push away my feet. They cast up against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They need no one to help them, as through a wide breach they come. Amid the crash they roll on. Terrors are turned on me. My horror is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. Even with all this, he didn't run. He was willing to sit on that ash heap and scrape his boils with a piece of pottery and endure the ridicule. Imagine sitting in pain and people are standing around mocking you. And it seems like perhaps they're physically attacking him. He compares himself to a city. When a city is attacked, does the city move? No, the city can't move. Walls surround cities. Before soldiers would attack a city, they would make plans because they needed to get over those walls. They either needed to climb them or break through. And in the meantime, the soldiers outside would make traps so the people in the city couldn't easily escape. They'd destroy the roads so that anyone who managed to escape would run into trouble. Job felt like he was an inhabitant of one of those cities. He was just waiting for these youth to attack, come over the wall, and then he wouldn't be able to escape. And remember, he had been respected and honored, and he's going through this. Reminds me of our Savior. He was respected and honored by his apostles and the disciples, but he was humiliated before man. Verse 16 through 23 says, "And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about like the collar of my tunic. God has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer. I stand and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. You lift me up on the wind. You make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. For I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living." He has this burst of grief. He's wrestling with the pain of his disease. It's chewing at his flesh day and night. He's comparing that pain to clothing he can't take off. Still, with all that pain, with all that ridicule, the worst part of his suffering is the sense that God left him and was against him. He felt like he was going to die any moment. He really wasn't, at least soon, but he felt like it. Verses 24 through 31 says, "Yet does not one in a heap of ruins stretch out his hand and in his disaster cry for help? Did not I weep for him whose stay was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? But when I hoped for good, evil came, and when I waited for night, darkness came. My inward parts are in turmoil and never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. I go about darkened, but not by the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I am a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black and falls from me, and my bones burn with heat. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep." We see some more of his physical problems here. His skin has turned dark. He's been sitting out in that ash heap, and he is burning with fever. It seems that Job is contrasting his own attitude toward the suffering of others with God's lack of concern for his suffering, where we know in reality God cares about our suffering. He is with us during our suffering. In Job 31, verses 1 through 4, it says, "I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? What would be my portion from God above and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Is not calamity for the unrighteous and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does not he see my ways and number all my steps?" Series of questions. In chapter 1, we saw that Job was a blameless and upright man. This chapter explains what kind of life that was, how he lived as a righteous man. It has an interesting similarity to ancient defense documents. It's similar in form, if not content, to the pagan negative confession given by the deceased who stood before Osiris in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Under oath, the subject lists the evil things he has not done with the hope that he will be vindicated and pass through the portal safely. So you see here, he's listing all the things he has not done. A lot of the sins Job hasn't committed are the same issues Jesus covers in Matthew 5-7. He hasn't lusted. He hasn't hated his neighbor. He hasn't withheld alms and social justice. He hasn't loved money and more. In the verse, it talks about a virgin. One commentary says the virgin is the goddess of fertility in Canaan, kind of like Venus, but for the Canaanites. If so, Job's saying he never worshipped her. Lust, it's interesting because the sin of lust is attitude. It's the idea that the eyes are the gateway to lust. In their culture, it would have been somewhat acceptable for a rich and powerful man like Job to seduce and take a maiden, and then add her as a wife or a concubine. Job says he didn't do this because he believed it was a sin. Verse 5-8 says, if I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has gone after my eyes, and if any spot has stuck to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. In a negative confession, a crime would be, you would say, I haven't done this crime, by calling down a curse upon someone who did do that crime. So that's what Job's doing here. He was sure about what kind of righteousness he had lived in his life. Verse 9-12 says, if my heart has been enticed toward a woman, and I have lain in wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down on her. For that would be a heinous crime. That would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For that would be a fire that consumes as far as Abaddon, and it would burn to the root all my increase. Job is insistently and emphatically saying he did not entice a woman. He did not seduce a woman. Enticement, according to this, is controllable, and giving into enticement is sin. Verse 10, grinding grain is a woman's work, usually done by a slave. But here, it's somewhat raunchy, basically saying that if Job had sinned by taking another woman, then he deserved to have his wife taken and turned into a prostitute. Verse 13-15, if I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? This strophe is about how he treated his servants well. David Guzik says, the goodness of a man or a woman is often best indicated by how they treat those thought to be inferior to them, not how they treat their peers or those thought to be superior to them. This was not typical in the ancient world. Job was extraordinary, and he lived a righteous life. He treated his servants well because he recognized them as fellow human beings. Again, this was extraordinary. And notice who makes a babe in the womb. It's God. We are a gift from God from the moment we are placed in a womb. Verse 16 through 23 says, if I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or I have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten it. For from my youth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he has not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, because I saw my help in the gate, then let the shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. For I was in terror of calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty. So this strophe is about how Job was kind to the poor and helpless. Again, he calls down a curse if it's not true. Most of these things by themselves are simple, ordinary things, but you put it all together, it's pretty impressive. He cared for the poor, and he showed that in his actions. Verse 24 through 28, if I have made gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant. Sorry, my mouth isn't working well today. Let me read that again. If I have made gold my trust, or called fine gold my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was abundant, or because my hand had found much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, then also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I would have been false to God above. So Job is saying he didn't trust in his riches. He wasn't prideful about what he owned. And if he was, may God curse him. Verse 26, what it means when it's talking about he didn't look at the sun or the moon, he didn't engage in the common practice of sun worship or moon worship. Apparently, a sign of this worship was kissing your own hand when an idol wasn't close enough to kiss. It's like blowing kisses. Verse 29 through 34 says, if I have rejoiced at the ruin of him who hated me, or exulted when evil overtook him, I have not let my mouth sin by asking for his life with a curse. If the men of my tent have not said, who is there that has not been filled with his meat? The sojourner has not lodged in the street. I have opened my doors to the traveler. If I have concealed my transgressions as others do, by hiding my iniquity in my heart, because I stood in great fear of the multitude, and the contempt of families terrified me, so that I kept silence and did not go out of doors. Job claims he wasn't happy when his enemies had suffered and had been destroyed. In Ezekiel 33:11, it talks about a man after God's heart doesn't take pleasure in the destruction of the world. How tough is it not to curse your enemies? But Job didn't. He also says he was great at hospitality, at welcoming traveling strangers. Verse 33, if I had concealed my transgressions as others do, some versions say as Adam did, meaning Job took blame for when he did wrong, unlike Adam, who blamed Eve. And he also tried to hide from God. So he is saying, if I have done this, then curse me. Verse 35 through 37, I'm going to read the last part of verse 34 because it's all part. So that I kept silence and did not go out of doors. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. Here he changes his tone. He's so sure of its innocence. He's confident of this truth, that he's willing to take oaths for it. In Hebrew, it says, here is my Taw, T-A-W. Taw is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's like putting an X on your as a person's mark. Here's my Taw. It's interesting, the shape of the Taw looks like a cross. Job ends this argument with a cross. Job believes all he needs is an answer from God, and now he's demanding one. In chapter 42, Job repents of this, realizing he had no right to demand an answer from God. He wanted God's accusation against him in writing. Of course, we have a picture of what's really going on. We know it's Satan and not God who's approving or who's accusing him. This chapter ends with 38 through 40. If my land has cried out against me, and its furrows have wept together, if I have eaten its yield without payment, and made its owners breathe their last, let thorns grow instead of wheat, and foul weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. Job calls a witness on his behalf, his own land, his property. That was pretty normal in their kind of thinking. The land is personified as a chief witness of the crimes committed on it. Now, Job's words really aren't ending. He's going to talk a little more in some future chapters. If you look at it, it's not in quotations. So it doesn't mean I'm done with you all. But it's the end of the speeches with the friends and the end of Job's expressions of pain. So next session, we're going to get into chapter 32, and we're going to see a new character. Hope you join me for that, and thank you for joining me here. And again, if you like this, please click the like button and consider subscribing so you'll be notified when there's a new session. Thank you.